Hello again. You might hear my son in the background because he's right on the other side of that wall. And unfortunately, he's wired in, and this is the only space where I can do this. So I've asked him to be quiet, but he gets excited in his games. So it might not happen. I apologize if you hear any yelling like that. So I'm just gonna jump right in, and I hope I have all of your questions. And once again, I wrote down. See, I got all organized this month, and I was like, I'm gonna make sure I write down the name of who asked the questions. But y'all asked more than one question, and I had it there, and I was like, Janelle asked, and Cervantes asked, and then I had to sort of rearrange the questions so that they were kind of grouped together and didn't move the names with them. So once again, I apologize if I don't say your name and you ask the question, because that's my disorganization that's made that happen. So my bad. Sorry. Anyway, there was only a couple questions specifically about books, so I just want to cover those first. Oh, and while I'm thinking about it, you will see this video on the 5th and on the 9th, which is a Sunday in the USA, and 1 o'clock Pacific time, that's Los Angeles time, that's 4 o'clock Eastern, we are doing the live for all 3 of the books that completed this year without events. So that is Forbidden Prince, His Stolen Luna, and Demon Slayer. I'm going to do them in that order, and I'm going to post times. There's going to be time slots for each one. So if you've read one and not the others, you can come, if you want to the portion that's specifically about that book. Or if you can't make it on Sunday the 9th, send me questions in DMs, and I will add them and we'll cover them so that you can listen to the recording later. And that will also be time stamped so you know which part to listen to for which book. Anyway. So Sravanthi had a couple questions that were from Dark Alpha, Rise of the Dark Alpha. The first was, why are Sasha and Zev called Sasha Dawn and Zev Dan? I wanted to make a really clear distinction between the chimera culture and the human culture, or the sort of structure that had been put around the chimera by the humans. So I wanted them to have a way to refer to some forms of authority, whoever was the form of authority, like a title like king and queen, but not that, because it's more of the sort of pack hierarchy picture. And I don't honestly remember specifically why I chose Dawn and Dan, but I can tell you that the idea of adding an honorific at the end of the name or the word or the referral actually came out of my experience when I first started at Web Novel. Because I had been traditionally published before, there's hundreds, technically thousands of writers at Web Novel, but there's hundreds that are sort of active at any given time. And I was in a lot of author chats with a lot of young or inexperienced writers. And because of my bio and stuff, they learned that I was traditionally published, and that was, in some of their cultures, meant that they referred to me, and I didn't know this when I first came into these chats, but like they would put little additions at the end of my name or refer to me as author, like author Sama or something like that. And so I had to ask, because I didn't know what some of these little things meant, and most of the time they were just signs of respect, or signs of somebody who is accomplished or seen as being at a higher level. And I thought that was so, well, I thought it was really sweet that they did it. But I found it really interesting and fascinating, because we don't have anything really like that in our English language that is something that you can just give to somebody when you refer to them, to show respect or to recognize holding them in esteem. So I just like that. And so when I needed something for Zev and Sasha, I thought, well, okay, so what are we going to have the Chimera do to kind of recognize their alphas? And so I went with, it's not the same words that they use, but that idea of, okay, so there's something that we add to the end of the name. And at the beginning, or near the beginning of the book, when they first arrive in Thana, and Duncan tells Zev that he referred to Sasha as Sasha Dawn. The reason Zev's like, oh, thank you, is because he knows that the only reason Duncan did that was because of Zev, because Duncan was essentially recognizing Zev as the true alpha, and because Sasha's his mate, giving her that honorific as well. Um, and so that was really touching to Zev in that moment. And that was something that I realized I don't think I ever really explained that in the book, but I loved that little moment. Are the humans who invaded Anima and who created Chimera the same? So I was gonna say spoiler alert. It's a little bit late now. Sorry. If you haven't read the end of Taming the Queen of Beasts, this might be a good time to sort of fast forward for a minute or two, because I'm going to talk very specifically about the end of that book. So spoiler alert, if you're not through Queen yet, jump ahead. So the humans that we saw arrive in Anima, in Queen, are not the same people that were the team that you see in Dark Alpha. However, there is a relationship between them. The humans that caused such problems for Zev and the Chimera are, I suppose you would say, the next generation. So the scientists and the people involved that you see in Queen, those people either died, well, most of them died, but the ones that remained in the human world, some of them got fired, some of them left. There was a lot of destruction happened to their whole program when they lost all of that technology and access to Anima. So the project changed as a result of that. And if you're reading Warrior Beast, you're already sort of getting hints of this. What happened over time was that the same, I guess, organization or the same goal, people working towards the same goal, later on undertook a different type of research, a new project. And that's how Zev and the Chimera came to be. So there's a relationship between, but they're not the same people. Like if I'd had people that survived from Rika's, staff and whatever, they would not be people that you would see in Dark Alpha. It's decades later. And Janelle, I know who asked this one. Janelle asked, have you written any of your own life experiences in any of your books to date? If so, what was it and why? So I've talked to you guys before about how, for me, fiction is a attempt to talk about the truth of life, but in fiction, in romance and fantasy. So taking real things, but sort of depicting them in fictional ways, and then having an opportunity to have a dialogue about that. So on that level, all of my books draw from my life experience, draw from my emotional experience, from things that I've learned, from things I've seen in other people's lives. So generically, all of my books have that. If you're wondering about sort of specific plot events or, I can't think. So most of you haven't read. There's two books on Amazon. One's called Breakable. It's a re-release of a book that was traditionally published, and I got the rights back to it this year. That book has I don't want to say it's not autobiographical by any stretch. It's a magical realism, but it draws on experiences that I had in high school. I was very severely bullied. I didn't know that that's what was happening to me. It was things were different back then in terms of how people referred to this stuff, and bullying was primarily a word used for physical, when it's usually used with boys, meaning, some kids going to school and getting beaten up or getting his lunch money stolen, that kind of thing. Um, so the stuff that was happening to me, I thought was just, oh, I'm just super unpopular. That's what I used to tell people. I'm really unpopular. Um, and that book came out of me processing the things that happened to me as a teenager, at the hands of my peers, and the effects that the psychological effects that had, that I carried with me even as an adult. Um, and so, on one level, that book is my story in the sense that it draws very heavily from, not necessarily exact exchanges, but certainly the way that I lived my life back then, and the ways that I felt, and the ways that people would come at me. Um, I'm not sort of being cagey. I didn't use direct events from my life because I didn't really want to, but um, B, you have to do things that serve the story. And so, in terms of the interactions and different things that happen, you need to set it up in a way that works for the story that you're telling. But I mean, I could, on an emotional level, that book is autobiographical. And on a sort of practical level, even though that might not be the exact exchange that occurred, or it might not be the exact event or the exact prop that was used. Those, things very much of that ilk happened to me for years, and being the person who is that person in a peer group, it has a massive effect on you that you actually don't even realize. I certainly didn't till probably my mid late 20s, I think, was when I started really processing what had happened to me. And so then in my mid 30s, I wrote that book. I think it was my mid 30s. Gosh, has it been that long? It has. Um, and that was kind of the final step for me, because at that point I had thought that I'd sort of forgiven everybody, and I'd moved on. But in the writing of that book, I had to, like, I wrote furiously for like 8 or 9 weeks, I think. It was a few weeks anyway. I had probably 75% of the book done, and there was a time I had to put it aside and kind of go back into processing, like personal processing, because it brought back up all of the stuff that I had been through as a young person, and made me so angry and so sad and sort of defensive on my own behalf, because of course at this point I'm an adult. Um, so yeah, there was, I think about 3 weeks where I couldn't write it. I had to sort of step out of it and do some more processing with God, before I could come back to it and do it in a healthy way. So that one would be the one that would be the closest to my own experience. The other book that's on Amazon, which is called, what did I call it? See, I had to change the titles when I re-released them. Under My Skin, it's called. And both of these books are listed under Amy Lynn. That's not the names that they were published under, or the titles they were published with, traditionally. But with Under My Skin, it draws on the experience I observed. I had a dear friend, in high school, and as we grew into adults, and sort of were looking back, I started that story kind of wanting to rewrite her history, the things that I had seen and the things that I had come to understand as an adult that she had only ever really hinted at. And so I ended up again with that book. I think I was about halfway through, maybe even earlier than that. I'm not sure. But I ended up sending it to her, and just being like, hey, I've been working on this story and just wondering what you think. Um, and bless her heart, she loved it and felt that it was very true. Again, I wasn't using exact events. I was not taking her life and turning it into something, that was a fiction, but I was drawing on the types of things that had happened, or the um, the ways that she'd been affected by things in her family. Um, and um, and I think I still have it in the dedication. I'm not sure because I changed the dedication a couple of times. But at some point it was, I wish this was your story. Um, and so even though that's not drawing on my life in particular, it is drawing on an experience I had watching somebody else go through stuff that was really hard. Sravanthi asks, how do you come up with the names for your characters? True story, 9 times out of 10. So there's probably about 10% of the names just come. Like you literally are in the story thinking of a character and there's just a name that just fits, like right off the bat. That's what they're called. But most of the time, what I do is I at least start with a Google search on baby names that mean X, and it'll be something that's either prevalent to the character themselves or to their personality or to the world that they're in. And I'll go through lists. Sometimes I end up getting off track and they end up getting called something that's not on, that doesn't mean that. But a lot of the time they do. If you look up the names, especially of the main characters, a lot of times they mean warrior or wolf or strong or king or just something that was relevant. But more recently, as you guys know, I've also had readers suggesting names, especially for the fantasy books, for the Anima and Chimera, and that's been actually hugely helpful because those names can be hard to come up with. So I've already in Warrior Beast, I've already named a few side characters after names that you guys gave me, and there's more coming. I hope you like them. I hope you like the way I use them. Nick's asked, does your husband read your books or any of your family members? And if so, what's your husband's favorite character? No, my husband, my parents, and my sister and my nieces have read my traditionally published books. My husband and didn't read them until they were probably, the first one I think was about 3 years old. My sister was the one who's read everything like early on. In fact, I think she read them before they got published. And then she gave my teen books, which are the ones on Amazon, she gave those to her daughters when they became teenagers, or we did. My dad read my first book, which is now called Breakable, before it got traditionally published. I was going to I self-published it very briefly. And he read the first sort of iteration of it, which wasn't as good. He did a lot of proofing for me. My mother read both of them just a few years ago, because those books are now 8 years old, I think. 7 and 8 years old, 6 and 8 years old. So no, most of my family are not readers. And I'm really not worried about that. Like, I talk to them about the books. They learn things about the books. Alan knows, lots of the character names, and he knows who the main characters are, and he even knows some of the plot things that happen. But no, none of them are like following my stories. And people get upset about that. It doesn't upset me because I'm a reader, and I know if I'm not interested in the story, there's nothing worse than trying to plow through something long that I'm not interested in. So I want to write for people who want to read what I write. So no, it doesn't bother me that they haven't read it, or if they don't read it, or if they only read part of it. But my husband does, because we have conversations and because I talk to him about stuff that you guys say. He's aware of a lot of the characters, and we talk about different things. And he loves Reth, and he likes to joke about how Reth is based on him or looks like him, or my covers, that he's the model for my covers and stuff like that. What genre do you not write but wish that you could? I wish I could write crime books, like the real in-depth. There's two books that I really admire. One was A Time to Kill by John Grisham, and the other was The Pact by Jodi Picoult. There's actually a whole lot of books in that genre that I love, and I've read a ton of them. It used to be pretty much all that I read. I moved out of that stuff 20 years ago. But from sort of my teens until sort of, I'm going to say mid-20s, pretty much all I would read was the sort of crime thriller murder, detective on the, or that type. I don't like gory stuff, but I like the stuff that feels real and gritty, like police and FBI and stuff like that. And the closest I got to writing something like that is Secretly Loved by the Dangerous CEO, which is on web novel. And I did draw on because I worked for the police in New Zealand for a while. Not as an officer, I was a support person, but I was working with all of the managers for the region. And so that meant that I got to be involved with the special operations groups and special departments and stuff like that. So I got to work a murder case and take statements and do things like that. So I do have an awareness of how that process works sort of behind the scenes. And I definitely drew on that a little bit, but because CEO it's not really focused on the crime side. That's just sort of around what's going on. So no, I've never used it. And part of the reason is because I know enough that I could make something sound real to someone who doesn't know anything, but I don't know enough to make it sound real to somebody who's really in it, or at least not consistently. And I hate that. So I'm a big horse girl, for example. Cannot stand when I read a book and there's something that I'm good at and know a lot about in it, and it's very obvious that the author doesn't know what they're talking about. I hate that. And I know with sort of the crime legal side, there's so many intricacies to that, and you'd really need to know what they say, what they do, what the procedure is, all of that. And I just don't have the energy. So I probably won't ever write a book like that. But that is what I would write if I could. So all the rest of these I think are about characters. 2 different people asked who my favorite villain is and why. And that's a really hard one. Okay, so first of all, do you count Laren as a villain? Because if you do, he's my favorite, hands down. But because he doesn't end up a villain, I figure he doesn't really count. And then there's a difference between whether I like writing them or whether I like them as people. If I had to, if I knew I could be completely safe and I was going to sit down and have dinner with one of them, it would be Douglas from Secretly Loved by the Dangerous CEO. That man is fascinating to me, and in a kind of sick way. I do not in any way want him to be real. I do not in any way want to meet anybody like him. But the way his mind works and the things that he is willing to do and the way he parses things out. This is the thing that I love to do with villains. And this kind of ties into the next question, which is how do you come up with layered and complicated villains? So I'm going to kind of answer these two together. The reason Douglas is the most interesting to me is because of how he thinks. And the reason that's interesting to me is because my goal always with villains, and I don't always achieve it, but my goal always with villains is to make them whole people. It's very, very easy with villains in fiction, especially romance fiction, to turn them into sort of, mustache twirling, um, just pure evil. They're just nothing but evil. And even though that can be fun to write, it doesn't feel deep to me. It doesn't feel realistic. And it doesn't give the same conflicts that somebody who's a little bit more ambiguous would give. So, for example, Nick in Dark Alpha, to me, is probably the most interesting. I would count him as a villain, even though technically he's not. I mean, he is literally the most ambiguous character I've ever written. Um, no matter what side of the coin you stand on, Nick is a villain in some way. And that to me is just astounding. He was hard to write, or rather, it wasn't hard to know what to do with him. It was hard to know how to make sure it came across to the reader, because I'm trying to make him like, you can't just sit there and say, well, he thinks this way and then does this. You have to show what he's doing, even when you don't know why. And I try to do this with all my villains, give them emotional depth and a wholeness to who they are. So that means, because I know it's true in life, good people do bad things and bad people do good things. Or there are people who can love deeply, some people, and then be extremely cruel and hateful to others. Or, because a relationship changes, someone can turn from somebody who would be an advocate into a villain. I just know that this is true about human nature. We can be both. And I think it's unrealistic to have a person who's only evil. Most people, the things that they do that feel bad to me, they have a reason for doing them in their head. They see it from a different perspective. And the question, one thing I do want to write one day, is a story, I'm kind of working on one right now, is a story where both sides of a conflict see the other as villains, and both sides actually aren't, or both sides are, depending how you look at it. Because I think that's really true. I think that's really true in life. We do things, we say things, and the reasons that we have aren't villainous most of the time. Most of the time, it's not evil that drives us. Most of the time, it is that we see something in a certain way and we're trying to achieve something, but that hurts somebody else. So it feels evil to them. Anyway, my villains are villains. Doug, especially. And Nathan from Rise of the Dark Alpha. He was kind of fun to write because I got to be like the most emotionally indifferent. Like, he just does not care. He does not care about anybody else at all. He cares only for what he is trying to do. Um, that's not to say he takes pleasure in hurting, because that's the other thing. I think a lot of villains are written quite sadistically. And I think, like, for example, Doug has a little bit of that, but not with people he, to his mind, cares about. So he doesn't sit there with Dane and go, I want to hurt you, and it's more that he's so single-minded and so determined to achieve his ends that he will do whatever it takes to get there. In fact, I would say that's probably the primary personality trait of most of my villains, that they are aiming for something and they don't care what gets in the way. They're going to go for it. Because that can turn into great evil, even if people start in a good place, I think. So, who's my favorite villain? Technically Doug, but honestly, I kind of like all of them. And how do I write them? I write them by giving them things that are good, things that they do care about, things that, or people that they will, at least in their way, give to or protect, and also let them be intelligent. I think that's also a big failing in a lot of fiction, is that villains do stupid things because it serves the story, when actually an intelligent villain, somebody who really is working hard to do something well, um, they're a lot more interesting and a lot harder to beat. So it can get pretty tricky when you're like, okay, so he's going to think of that. Like Doug, for example, had a whole bunch of technology, had a whole bunch of people at his beck and call, had law enforcement under his thumb. Like there was very little that you could do to get around him consistently. And that made the whole story very difficult to tell. But I enjoy that kind of challenge. Of all the characters you ever wrote, who do you hate the most? Well, but see, they're the answer is kind of the same. Even though I find Doug fascinating and I like to write him, the reality is he is a horrible person. He is what, society would deem a monster. And I have zero respect for that. um, who do I hate the most? See, I don't feel like I really hate any of my. Oh, you know what? I really can't stand, and I'm gonna say her name wrong because it's been so long since I've been in the book. In Forbidden Prince, is it Saria, the woman who's trying to get eaten, and he deceives her, which he shouldn't have done, but she's so conniving. She's actually not a villain in the sense that she doesn't have evil intentions, like, I'm going to take over the world, I'm going to murder people. It's not like that. It's just pure selfishness. She wants him, and she's going to do what she can to manipulate and put pressure on to get him. I actually hate her a whole lot more than I hate somebody like Doug or Nathan, who are upfront about who they are and what they're doing, and they're just unapologetic about it. So yeah, I would say that's true in life as well. Like if you and I have opposing views, but you're open about them and you're like, this is the way it is, I can respect that. I might not like it, might not want to hang out with you, but like I can respect that. I can't stand people who present themselves to be one thing when they are actually another, and who manipulate and gaslight and do things, deceive people knowingly to gain their own ends. Like, I do not like people like that at all. And I will call them on it. This is one of the beauties of being a former addict. Addicts are very manipulative, and generally it's a combination of never having grown up emotionally because they've always used their addiction to kind of get through stuff, but also you have to be when you're constantly juggling to try and hide a part of your life that's so prominent. Or, for example, like drug addicts who get into issues with money. And there's a lot of theft and deception involved in manipulation and trying to get people to give you money and stuff like that. I was an extremely good liar early in my life, up until I was about 30. And so I can pick them now. I mean, there's some advantages to this, right? I can pick a liar, I can pick a manipulator, and I'll call them on it. And they don't like that. But the ones that want to be healthy will let you do it. I can always tell when somebody is. Sorry about that. I got interrupted because I have a family and men and boys can't answer their own questions. Anyway, I can always tell a manipulator, and I can always tell an addict who's not being honest about wanting to get healthy by the way they phrase things when they talk about it, and by the responses they give to me or other people. And I'll call them out on it, and they don't like it. But it's a good way to kind of cut through the dross. Manipulation, I think, is a tool that many people use subconsciously. I shouldn't say I think, I know. There's a lot of people who manipulate without even really realizing that that's what they're doing. But yeah, people who manipulate intentionally or knowingly, those don't like that. Is it tough to write about heroes or bad guys we love to hate, or guys who we think are bad but end up falling in love with? So the hard part for me is when a character has to be seen to be something that I know they won't end up in. So for example, with Laren in King of Beasts, at the beginning of volume 2, which is where he comes to the fore and becomes a point of view character and he's a villain, it's really hard knowing where I'm taking him and knowing his true heart and knowing what's driving him to have so many people hating on him. But the problem is I need them to do that. Like, that's part of the journey of the book, right? You have to see him as a villain and dislike what he's doing and want to be mad at him or want him to change, so that when he does sort of have his epiphany and grow, it's satisfying. So on the one hand, it's hard watching people get angry or upset with somebody that I know is actually a good person. On the other hand, it's hugely satisfying. Laren is the first character that I ever intentionally wrote as a villain specifically to redeem them. And it was fun. I really enjoyed doing it. So no, it's not that it's tough. It's more that I'm so protective of them. Like, I'm dealing with this right now with Warrior Beast. Everyone's really mad at Elrith for the way that she's dealing with what's going on. But I know what's behind all of this, and I know where it's going, and I know why she's acting the way she's acting, why she's making these decisions. And I feel for her. Like, this is all, in my mind, for her, driven out of fear and pain and a desire to protect the people who are left. But I know when you know and care about the people that are the targets of this, it's really hard. You get really mad. This happens in real life too. So it's good. Like, on the one hand, it's like, yes, everybody's caught up in the emotion of it. That's good. That's what we want. But on the other hand, I'm like, oh, my poor Ella, because I know she's not. What she's doing it's not that her intentions are wrong. It's how she's dealing with it is the problem. She's acting right now out of trauma, not out of wisdom. But we all do that, right? Anyway. Last question. Do you think that any of the projects you had us review will ever come to be written anytime soon? So you guys have seen, I think, six or seven projects. Reluctant Alpha is going to get published. It might even be this year, but I don't know exactly. So yes, on that one, but just not sure on the timing. There's a couple other projects in there that I think really have legs that I would like to write, but whether I'll ever find a publisher who's excited about them or I'll come up with a way to make them more enticing, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But there is one project that you haven't seen that I am working on that is under contract, and it's a very exciting opportunity. And I'm hoping this week, or very soon after you see this video, I'm going to be able to share that with you, and the whole picture of what's going on, because it's very, very cool. But because it's very cool, I've had to keep it very much under wraps, and that's been hard because I've been wanting to show everybody everything. So short term, no, nothing that you've seen this year is going to get published in the very short term. Short to midterm, yes, you're going to see Reluctant Alpha either at the end of this year or early next. For the others, who knows? That is the truth. One of the early ones you saw, the Slave King, I still want to write that story, and I'm just really waiting for the trends to shift because I really want to write that story. And there's another couple that are in that group that you've seen that I still think about, and still think about the characters, and still, so yeah, there's stuff there that has my heart, but who knows? I can't write everything that I can't write every idea I come up with, but the idea that is getting published very soon that you're going to find out about, that's an idea I had, I kid you not, 8 years ago. I think it was 7 or 8 years ago. And suddenly now it's going to be a book. So, who knows? Anyway, that's all. It's really wonderful. Thank you for being here again. Thank you for your continued support. And I will talk to you next month. Look out, in a day or two, you're going to see the question post to ask questions for the next video. So you can do that on the next one in the next couple days. Next 48 hours, you'll see it. Thank you for being here. I'll talk to you soon.